again, it all going to small ownership of the rich and maybe the church, because network neutrality is now threatened, where your internet provider may get to decide who your content is coming from. It also already happens on cell phones to a great extent. You know, go on Virgin Mobile or something and try to get content that's not from Virgin and its providers. So what do we want to do to protect democracy? So you guys are involved here. First of all, the infrastructure is important. Network neutrality is important. If you're a radio frequency head, work on mesh networks, but you know, it hasn't become the big thing that we thought it would, where no one owns the infrastructure. We need net neutrality, and we also need a free tool set for people to communicate. We do not want to get into a situation where a small number of companies own the way that we all communicate and lock it down with DRM. Okay, the big horror story that we don't want to get is we don't want to get a world where all of the internet appliances are like the TiVo. Why? The TiVo works by paying for itself with the razor and blades model. And that means that the TiVo is sold for less than the TiVo actually costs. And you get the proprietary TiVo service for which no competitor is available for that particular kind of hardware. And that service is owned by TiVo, so obviously it is being used to pay for the production of the TiVo hardware itself, plus profit. So you get that kind of thing with internet radio too. There are a number of internet radios and internet television players that you can buy, where essentially the entire channel list is controlled by the vendor who sells you the device. And they do that so that they can get a kickback from the people that they allow to provide programming. And that can help them make a profit for selling this device. The problem is that this potentially locks out little guys like you and me, who have, in recent time, made massive change to the world because we had the power of a big television network. Okay, so we don't want the internet to be locked down with DRM to the point where you have to have a gatekeeper before you can communicate. We need network neutrality. We need a tool set, and that is open source, that can be used for all these purposes, that no one can control, that everyone can develop and improve. And these are the tools of democracy for the rest of our lives. So what do we do when we ask for legislation? If you are asking for a law that will help open source, do not go into the office of the president of the Chamber of Deputies and say, I want to start out by putting proprietary software out of business. And you can help open source by doing that. That will not fly because that government person is supposed to help everyone in this country, not one party over another. Well, it flew in Venezuela because they just didn't have much buy-in from proprietary software business there, but it won't fly in most places. What you do is you go into that government office and say, I want to have a law that puts open source and proprietary software on a level playing field where they can both compete on their merits, including what makes open source and proprietary software unique and different from each other. And I want this to be fair to both parties. Okay, you will not get legislation that helps open source unless it is fair to proprietary software. You will not win the battle in a political forum. And when we have tried to do that, it is blown up in our face. When this Venezuelan thing was happening, open source preference bills were seen as a threat. Large and very well-funded lobbying organizations were put to the task of fighting open source preference bills. And thus, very little in the way of open source preference bills actually passed in the real world. And indeed, we had United States ambassadors going to other countries and saying, don't have an open source preference bill because we don't think it's fair to the companies in our country. So you really should think about, how do I win the argument that I want to win while being fair to everyone else and thus making this an easy hill for a legislator to swallow. And another way we do that is we sell open source as an important way of innovating, and we have so many great examples. So that things like European Patent Litigation Agreement, which would make patents, software patents enforceable across Europe, can be shut down because it shuts out a new and very productive way of making innovation. At the same time, don't ask to throw out proprietary software for the sake of open source. No one will listen. Ask to promote both without damaging either. Encourage competition between them. Be fair. So, should we have open source preference laws? We should have a law that requires that open source be considered. And when you compare them on their merits, the merit of the open source licensing should be part of the comparison, not just a feature comparison. The merit of things like the source code being available and modifiable should be a merit in the comparison. So what I'm suggesting here is that we compare on real concrete things that you can do scientifically. You can make studies of them scientifically. And compare two products and come out with an idea of which one to buy, rather than say, we're going to prefer open source because we accept that it's superior a priori. When that a priori part comes in, don't expect the rest of the world to buy it. So what do we learn from all of this? Open source is an important means of innovation. It's an innovation in itself. The world is changing. We are a part of it. We could talk forever, or until we're thrown out. Those of you who have to go to the bathroom right now, please do so. The rest of you, until they throw us out, I'm going to open the floor for questions. You have an open source evangelist in front of you. What would you like to talk about? Go on.
Your one statement that do not confuse open source vendors with open source because their motivations are sometimes conflict. Well, if you have a business that is an open source vendor, I mean, can you elaborate? Are they a dying species? Should open source vendors not exist? I mean, what's the value add for the vendor to be true to open source and being a company at the same time?
So what can a vendor do to be true to open source and be a profitable company at the same time? It's really very hard. A lot of people are trying to do it. Some of them are doing it. What actually started me working out on this economic idea of users being the main force was the fact that we had seen a rash of failing open source companies that did damaging things to the community. And obviously at that time, SCO was an example. I would submit that the Novell-Microsoft agreement is an example, and that Novell would have had a very hard time not accepting $1/3 billion or whatever it was. What would you do for $1/3 billion? You got to understand that saying no would have been a very difficult thing for Novell, even though it wasn't right. So what I've come up with so far is not necessarily what you want to hear, which is that the economics of open source seems to work absolutely the worst for a Linux distribution of all of the things in the open source world, because the commercial Linux distribution is essentially remarketing other people's work to a great extent. Now, I know that Novell, for example, and certainly Red Hat as well, contributes very much to very many open source projects. However, the majority of what they do is that they take stuff that other people have done and they aggregate it and they put that out, and then they try to make money first on service, and we found out that service did not work for early adopters. Early adopters don't want hand-holding. It actually works a little better now than it used to. But so we saw stuff like Red Hat with Red Hat Network, where Red Hat Network will not tell the open source developer what's wrong with his own software. Only the people who pay Red Hat Network. And we saw SCO, where SCO wasn't making money. You know, they were Caldera back then. They had some serious problems with their idea of how this should ever work. You know, and Ransom is a really nice guy, but I think there were a lot of things that he never understood. And also, Ransom wasn't really in charge. It was some other people that you now know. And so, on the way that that company went down, they became incredibly hostile, I feel, to the free software community, because they grabbed at that straw as the last way of making some money out of their company. So we have this basic conflict, which is that, yeah, maybe enterprises will buy from Red Hat Novell, but someone else is always giving away the software, and you know what? They're giving away pretty good versions. So I'm having a lot of trouble figuring out how a for-profit Linux distribution walks the tightrope. You know, it's great if you can come in like Mark Shuttleworth, where you have tons and tons of money to invest, and you can take a really long view, and you don't care if you lose some of it because you blew $20 million just to take this little ride in space and stuff. So, so Ubuntu gets a whole lot of street cred because so far they do everything right. If he sells that business, will that still continue to happen? I have no idea. So a long time ago, I came up with an idea, which failed, but I have not given it up forever, to have a distribution which was directly user-supported in a sustainable fashion. And that was what User Linux was supposed to be. And I did some wrong things, and it did not work, and I might try again. We'll see. But I don't have a good answer for the distribution. Now, I don't know enough about Alfresco. Okay, I don't know how big is the external community, etc. So I'm not really going to comment much about that. I do know about Source Labs. Source Labs has some tension. Because obviously Source Labs has to make money. We're a startup. We had a competitor, which was Spike Source. Spike Source has been doing some medium nasty things on the way to trying to make themselves profitable, including a reasonably large involvement now with Microsoft. That could end up being community hostile. Source Labs has not had to do that yet. However, Source Labs remarkets the software of another open source project run by another company. And if Source Labs were making more money, we would probably just give those guys money. But right now, we don't, and they would rather kill us. Okay? So even if you try to do everything right, you can end up being in a hostile situation with another commercial open source company entirely of their choice and not in your control. So these are the decisions that make life hard for managers and why I get paid a salary every day. I spend, just to give you guys a little background on that, I am supposed to spend half of my time working for Source Labs and half of my time being a free software leader entirely on my own recognizance. Source Labs pays for both halves, gives me a credit card, and never ever argues about what is on the card. So I fly out to here. I did not even ask them. And I say bad things about Novell. Well, you know what? Novell is a Source Labs customer. Okay? I make sure I'm saying them for Bruce and not for Source Labs. And Source Labs' official company policy, which they would tell Novell if Novell ever asked, is Bruce does a lot of good things for us. And we could fire him, but we can't shut him up. So if we can't shut him up, what's the point in firing him? So that's a really good company to do that. And obviously they get some street cred, etc. However, Source Labs is aware that if they made a agreement like the Novell Microsoft agreement, that I would do exactly what Jeremy did, which is, I would say it's bad, say it's bad, say it's bad, decide I'm not being listened to, leave, say it's bad. Okay? What can you do? When you've got no other choice, you vote with your feet. So I have a lot of sympathy for the plight of people working here at Novell because, well, first of all, a lot of the folks here in Utah didn't make this dumb decision anyway. It was folks in Boston. And a lot of you guys don't like it. But you have the choice of sticking around or having to leave Utah because, hey, there aren't that many jobs doing what you do here yet. Or having to have your family go hungry. So stay here. Okay, I'm not asking you to quit unless you're Jeremy, because anybody will hire Jeremy. Yeah, Google, they probably would hire a lot of you anyway. So I don't really have a good answer for you, sir. Except that, the one I said, which is that I think the entire concept of your business is not the best idea. And that I have not come up with a working example of a replacement for it yet, although I've tried. What else can you do? Hire me. Because the cool thing about hiring me is it actually gets me under NDA. Source Labs will shop me out to various people who need advice. And there are times, when I'll tell you you're wrong and tell you you're wrong and tell you you're wrong and not work for you anymore. And probably have very limited options about what I can say. Hopefully you have other open source evangelists who can do this. It sounds to me like Nat Friedman was in a very difficult position. However, I encouraged Nat to leave because I felt that Nat being in the position that he was, that was really the best thing for Nat to do. And that Nat did have lots of money coming out of the sale of Zimian and other stuff. He could have done it. So I'm sure Nat's not happy with me about that, and some people here are not happy with me about asking that of Nat, but that was how I called it. But if what you do is mostly work on a particular piece of software and you are not listened to at the level that Nat is, I'm not asking you to quit your job. That would be stupid. Okay, so having not answered that question, let's go on to the second one. Go on.
You made a comment in one of the slides that because Microsoft sells their software, it's not differentiating software. I would contest that. If you sell your software, you do control who can use it and who can't. And therefore, I would say that does make it differentiate.
It differentiates for Microsoft.
But
Okay, so it is a differentiating product for Microsoft Corporation.
Right.
However, it is not a differentiating product for the customer. That's the whole deal.
Okay, but
Alfresco,
addressed because you can buy Microsoft product, that makes it not differentiating for you. The slide said Microsoft sells their software, so it's not differentiating.
it's not yes. So
I think that's a misleading
so,
statement. Then, if you're talking about the customer,
well, it's a slide.
That has greater implications in the market because you can base a lot of what you're developing on open source, which is the non-differentiating part of your software, and sell what sits on top of it. And
everyone does.
Keeps that differentiating. Well, the slide leads you to believe that because you sell it, everyone has it, so it's no longer differentiating.
Yeah, so I tried to make the point verbally. Obviously, slides are notes. And the point is that Alfresco is very definitely differentiating for Alfresco. And Microsoft software is differentiating for Microsoft. And the products that Source Labs offers obviously differentiate Source Labs, even though some of it is really just repackaged open source. However, the entire premise of the talk is to view this from the customer perspective. And that's why I present it this way. And the reason I have is actually I'm saying something a little bad about the vendor perspective. Well, actually, I'm saying a couple bad things about the vendor perspective. First of all, most of us are software users rather than software developers. However, we all, if we are part of this dominant mindset, think about software and software development from an extremely vendor-centric perspective. When you ask the average person how software is developed, they will tell you essentially how Microsoft works. Okay, when you say you're going into the software business, one of the questions, a cliche that you will get is, how are you going to be the next Microsoft? And I had people ask me, how are you going to be the next Microsoft with free software? Okay, I never wanted to be the next Microsoft. I wanted a piece of the pie big enough to feed my family and keep them in the house and keep me flying around and doing speeches and being flighty. So, which takes a lot less than having $40 billion in the bank. The real premise here is that vendors are not so essential for the creation of software, and that the world would go on and software would go on without them. And of course the next sentence is, sorry vendors. And it's the same as the people who made the ice. So sorry if that did not come over the way it should. More questions? Go on.
You mentioned not being an over-evangelist, bringing, let's burn the boats, let's get rid of all your software. How do you go about patching relationships with organizations that have had a bad open source experience? Someone's come in preaching open source is the panacea for whatever you need, and the project blows up, and then...
Time heals all wounds. It's not a good answer. But you will find that there are executives who are just not willing to look at it again until they see someone else making out with it in a financial way. They see that the whole rest of the world they see that the whole rest of the world is doing it and not them, so now they're old-fashioned, etc. It becomes a matter of individuals. But the way that you can potentially do it is by looking at how the loser lost and not doing those things, and potentially in your promotion of open source, making it very clear, as I hope I do, I try, that you're not asking people to wear a hair shirt, you're not asking them to burn the boats, you're not asking to put the business at risk for Richard's a priori value of freedom. Okay, and I support Richard 100%, but I know that there are people in the world who I will win over if I do not talk like Richard. So those are the things that you do. Patience is a really good thing to have. And you know, it's funny, I go on talk radio sometimes, and people call me up, and they say they work in proprietary software, and they apologize. And it's like, no, you should apologize for working in proprietary software to anyone but yourself if you would rather be working in open source, and then you make that balance yourself. Richard would probably have you, I know he said this once, but I'm not representing that I'm quoting him entirely accurately. He once suggested that people take jobs like being a waiter so that they could have, not use their brains very much and have time to work on free software. Now, this was entirely sensible for Richard, because Richard lives a very modest life. And Richard would have you live the way that he lives. Richard won some years ago the MacArthur Foundation grant, which gives you some number of millions of dollars now that essentially, if you're smart, you can support yourself for the rest of your life being some sort of creative artist or innovator. But you have to live rather frugally if you want to do it for the rest of your life. And the MacArthur Foundation actually doesn't say you have to do this. They just give you the money. You can buy a yacht if you want. And Richard took this money and he invested it. I'd actually love to hear what it's invested in, but I know that it is invested very conservatively. And it is invested in such a way that it will pay Richard a salary for the rest of his life. And he lives in an apartment. I don't think he owns a car. He lives entirely the way he'd have you live as far as not using proprietary software. He doesn't have a cell phone. So that works for him, but that's not what I'm going to ask of anyone else. So I guess what I'm really coming down to here is try and make small incremental changes. And some of us are lucky to see that we have made big changes in the world. This is something that I will forever be grateful for, and obviously I'm standing on the shoulders of people like Richard in having done it. What did I help do? I just helped translate his ideas, okay? So, sometimes it just pays to wait. Maybe someone else will have an idea to make it work if you can. Next question.
Is there an effective way as a consumer to influence hardware companies for more open drivers? I've tried, going through tech support, requesting, something good at work, or but I feel like I'm just talking to the wall.
Yes, you are. So I did a hardware project recently, which I have to publish. I bought one of these motherboards with the Intel chipset, which has the fully open 3D accelerated driver that the Intel X team has been working on. So that now I have accelerated 3D with no proprietary driver, which we may eventually see on ATI, but not for another year, I think. Because they just said they'd come out with the specs, and once the specs are out there, we have to write the driver, because they can't get all the proprietary stuff out of their driver. That's the problem. And so I went and did that, and I'm actually publishing an article about how to do that. But during this project, I found out that the motherboard BIOS set up the MTRRs entirely improperly for Linux, and that performance of the graphics pretty much unpredictably went down to 1/5 of what I had already demonstrated, and I had no idea why. And it turned out that it was because I had enabled a motherboard fan in the BIOS. And that this motherboard fan had programmed I/O, and something went and set up the MTRRs for the programmed I/O to work, the memory type and range register. And then we essentially had none of the benefits of wide word I/O for graphics after that. And I wrote to the manufacturer, and the manufacturer said it wasn't a problem on Windows. And you know what? It wasn't a problem on Windows, because Windows was using this thing called Intel Performance Enhancement Technology that does what MTRRs do. And but it's harder to program, and it's not in the kernel yet. And so those guys aren't going to fix it. And I mean, that was a good interaction. There are lots of bad interactions where they just don't talk to you at all. What do? We have to use market power. We have the advantage that we are actually gaining on market power to the point where manufacturers actually want to be involved. I had started a project long, long ago, much too early for it to work, called openhardware.org, where I was running a certification program for hardware that could be driven by open source software, which would require that the hardware be publicly documented. I then went on to other things. I transferred this to someone else, and SPI lost the domain. So I just got the domain back this week, and I want to make it work again, that certification program. I need someone's help to work on that. Anybody who wants to work on that. Yeah, it was funny that openhardware.org was redirecting to a Bling vendor for 2 years. So anyway, so my strategy is that we will certify hardware that is open source friendly, and that this will actually become a market advantage to these manufacturers. Go on. We're going to get thrown out.
Yeah.
How long?
A few minutes, but we need to do
Okay, very good. So I'm going to take one question and try to give a short answer and then say bye-bye to everyone. Go on, sir.
This isn't a question, so maybe it doesn't count.
Okay.
I was just going to say, a lot of people hear blogs, and if you can, if you talk about what one hardware would do for you over another hardware in supporting open source or something like that, that's a way. I mean, you can support it by buying. You can also give a great company free advertising.
Yeah, guys,
great PR.
If there is something you feel strongly about, tell somebody. And telling somebody sometimes just means giving your friend a link to something that I or he has written, because you might not be able to put it into words as well yourself. But you guys with your voices can get quite a lot done too. well, gee, you know, if this were somewhere else than Utah, I'd say you can take me out for a beer, some of you, but maybe you can take me out for some tea, anyone who wants
Root beer.
Root beer. That's right. That's right. All right. So I would be happy to continue talking with the bloggers tonight. I'm not leaving until tomorrow. Thank you, everyone.
Once again, really like to thank Bruce. Very enlightening talk. As we close up, I'd like to remind people, yes, they are moving us out of the building for the night, but feel free, stay after, talk. I'm sure a lot of people, just like any other LUG meeting, will be discussing. Also a reminder, tomorrow morning, 8:30, the keynotes will start, so please show up a little early. We'll have hopefully some swag and some other stuff out.
We have some other announcements, too, we'll be making.
Yes.
Cool stuff coming out.
There's some cool stuff that we will be doing. On your way out, is there still a little food?
There's a bunch of food.
There's still some food.
Please
Help yourself. There's also the printed schedules for the next 2 days, so grab and make sure you figure out what you want, and then you do stuff. So we have a couple moments for one of our sponsors real quick that has something they want to tell
I'm going
us.
to make this quick. I feel guilty taking time away from such a great presentation. A piece of swag that didn't make it into your bags is the platform that DirectPoint delivers their services to small offices. It is just another distro. It does have some nice frosting on the top. What's especially cool is we got them to activate the services that are in the cloud, marketing speak. So it comes with fully updated security packages. It has snort,